Joining us right now is TCA Srinivas Raghavan, columnist and author. He's joining us here on Bloomberg Quint. TCA, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. First thoughts, what did you make of the RBI statement released after the board meet?
If you're honest about it, the government capitulated. I think basically the Reserve Bank won the day. There were three issues, and on each of them no decision was taken yesterday. I don't know what they were doing for 10 hours. But if at the end of the day it's this kind of decision had to be taken, then it could have been done in a much shorter space of time. So basically I think the RBI won the day. The finance ministry has had to pull back quite a lot. They will set up this committee and so on. So let's see. I mean that's way down the road. I have 25 crores or whatever it is for MSMEs and for the banks, TCA and all that. I would think that both sides have acted sensibly in as much as the government has not insisted on taking a hammer to crack a nut. So that's my take on it for the moment, anyway.
TCA, the committee that the economic capital framework has been referred to, is that fair in your view? Also, haven't the past committees been internal? So are you comfortable with the fact that this is going to be a committee jointly nominated?
Well, yeah, it doesn't matter now. I mean, you have a committee and it doesn't matter who puts the members there as long as the members know what they're talking about. And to my mind, the real conflict or whatever, controversy or debates or friction or whatever you want to call it, within that committee will arise when they sit down and assess the likely risk to the financial sector and within that to the banks over the coming years. And I've just tweeted this morning that what if the committee, on a fair assessment of the risks in the coming years, decides that the Reserve Bank actually needs more rather than less reserves? Then what happens? So this notion that it has got too much reserves, the benchmark is what some of the other central banks in the world have. The benchmark is not the risk to the Indian financial system, particularly because 70% or whatever of these banks, they are in government control. 11 of them are under PCA. More are likely to go under if some of the things that have been done, both by the UPA and the NDA governments, come to their logical conclusion. Now, one argument is that you cannot overestimate risk to the Indian banking system because they are owned by the sovereign and therefore they are not likely to go under. But going under is a very extreme thing. Banks, I think the last bank to have closed down before 2008 was in 1974 in Germany or somewhere. But banks don't close down. In America, they close down the small commodities banks and so on. But in general, the central banks don't allow banks to shut down. So what does that mean? You have to make sure that the bank remains afloat. How do you do that? You do that by giving it money. If you have the money, you give it. If you don't have the money, you print the notes and give it. And this is the thing about snatching a bit of the RBI's contingency reserves also, is that it's not something which is kept in a safe or in a godown or something. At the end of the day, when that book entry transfer is made, the RBI will have to print notes. So it's a form of it is deficit financing. Why is it a form of? It's just plain simple deficit financing. So instead of getting to your nose this way, you're going around this way. That's about the size of it. So I think coming back to the committee will have to take a very clear view on exactly what the risks to the system is. And until we do that, we honestly don't know how much reserves the RBI needs.
TC, assuming this is a very technical committee which has to go into a number of issues, it may take months perhaps to come out with a recommendation. Then the conversation doing the rounds about this money being used for either this year's fiscal deficit or some sort of pre-electoral promise, that conversation goes out of the window.
Yeah, I don't think there's any politics involved in this, except to the extent that the government might have wanted to spend a bit more before the election. And they didn't have the elbow room for that if they wanted to keep the fiscal deficit at 3.2 or whatever percent. But there's nothing holy about that level. Very few people remember or understand this, that the 3% figure was picked out of the blue by the IMF in 1982 or 83. It has no sanctity in economics. It has no sanctity in commerce. It has no sanctity in anything. It's just that the markets needed a benchmark figure, and they said, okay, let's make it 3%. India has managed to do pretty well with pretty high deficits, 6%, 6.5%, and the heavens haven't come crashing down. So the problem is not the level. I don't know why the NDA government is so hung up on this number. It's become, what in Hindi is called some kind of mooch ki ladai, that I will hold on to this. If you go to 4%, what's going to happen? It's not as if all the capital is already going out anyway, even with your commitment to 3.2% and whatever. So just if they want to spend a bit more before an election, and which is a fair thing, which happens in every country, just go ahead and print some notes. Restore. I was telling some people yesterday that one of the biggest mistakes that was made was to completely phase out the ad hoc treasury bills. See, they provided a comfort level to the government, which is very necessary for any government, and to have completely stopped them or limited them, that was not a very clever thing to have done. Because you can be in different kinds of holes. A government can find itself. Suppose, forget all this, forget election, forget all of these things. Just imagine if there's a huge natural calamity. And you need to spend, 30, 40,000 crores for rehabilitation or whatever. And at the same time, you want to stick to 3.2% or 3.5% fiscal deficit. What are you going to do? So I think we need to be a bit more sensible about these rigid IMF disciplines. And on that point, I would, Guru Murthy is articulating it badly, and he's making it a West versus us kind of thing. But what your needs are have to be determined by you. They cannot be determined on some global benchmark. Look at China. Does anybody care what kind of practices China follows? So I think to that extent, some good will come out of this, because we will assess things more sensibly without any great repercussions. Y.V. Reddy, when he set up that committee, the Usha Thorat thing, and they came up with that 12%, where did that 12% come from? It came out of Dr. Reddy's head, I think. Why 12? Why not 11.3, So I don't know. I think we just need to be more sensible.
All right. TCA, on the issue of some of the banking stuff, the extension of the capital conservation buffer deadline, TCA being referred to the committee of the board. Don't want to get into the individual issues, but does it not look like that the board is going to be a lot more involved in some of these routine decisions? Is that a good thing? These are all executive decisions.
Yes and no. That's an extremely complicated issue. I don't want to get into the entire history of boards of central banks and so on, but the fact is that India is the only country where the governor has been invested with powers, and not legally, by tradition and convention, by powers that he should not have. The level of consultation with the board tends to be minimal. Partly that's because the kind of people that the government nominates to the board. But before 1949, when RBI was nationalized, the board used to be very active. And in fact, it was so active that the British felt it necessary to have their own man as the governor. And his job was not so much to, I mean, there was the whole business of money supply and so on, monetary stability, all the rest of it. But a very important part of his job was to keep the board in check. And that was because the board had various interests being represented over there. And what the board wanted could often be at variance with what the British needed for their own purposes. So, post-nationalization, it's become a practice to assume that the board is just one of those things, dummy thing, and the governor has all the powers. But that's not the way it should be. I mean, you and I have both worked in newspapers. It's the same relationship between the group of editors who meet and the editor. It's not as if the group of editors has a overarching power over what is to be published or written the next day, but the editor listens. In the RBI, I'm afraid, this has not been happening to the extent it's necessary. Meetings used to be over in 1 hour, 1.5 hours. The discussions were perfunctory. Papers were sent, just before the meeting and so on. Members, I know RBI board members who used to regard it as a big bore, reading those things. So, and these were pretty distinguished people. It's not as if they were some, chaps off the road. So yes, to answer your question, the board should be involved more actively. But the board cannot direct the governor to do anything, because for that there's an entirely, as you know, different procedure laid down. So I hope these guys will change the way the RBI has been functioning in the last 60, 70 years. As a kind of a governor's thing. I've been writing this for a long time, that this is not the way to do it. You do need to consult others. The fact that the governor consults only the finance ministry and he doesn't consult the board, that's not a good thing, is it? The board is there for a purpose.